Do not sign that. The voice came from the back of the boardroom, quiet enough that several executives almost ignored it. Almost. Victoria Hale froze with the pen less than an inch above the resignation document. Around her, 30 senior leaders sat beneath cold white lights, watching the woman who had built Hale Dynamics into one of the most respected defense technology companies in the country prepare to surrender control of it. Richard Voss leaned back in his chair and smiled. I am sorry. Did maintenance just interrupt a board meeting? A few people laughed. Caleb Morgan stood near the doorway in a gray facilities uniform, an identification badge clipped to his chest, and a small tool pouch at his side. He looked exactly like what they believed he was. 42 years old. Tired eyes. Worn work boots. A single father who fixed doors, replaced ceiling panels, and disappeared before important people remembered his name. Victoria stared at him. Mr. Morgan, this is not the time. Richard chuckled. That is putting it politely. Another executive shook his head. Security should remove him. Caleb did not react. No embarrassment. No anger. No attempt to defend his place in the room. He simply looked at the document beneath Victoria's hand. 3 hours earlier, she had shocked the entire company by suspending Hale Dynamics' most valuable defense program after discovering that sensitive prototype data had been compromised. The announcement had sent panic through every floor of the building. Phones rang without stopping. Department heads whispered in hallways. Board members demanded explanations. By noon, Richard had already convinced half the leadership team that Victoria's decision proved she had become reckless. By 2 o'clock, they wanted her authority transferred. Now the papers sat in front of her. One signature, and everything her father had built would pass temporarily into Richard's hands. Mr. Morgan, Victoria said again, more firmly, please leave. Caleb's eyes moved to Richard, then to the glass conference room doors, then briefly toward the security panel mounted beside them. Richard noticed and smirked. See something broken? Caleb answered, maybe. Laughter returned, louder this time. Richard spread his hands. Then fix it. That is what we pay you for. Caleb lowered his gaze for a moment. He had heard that tone before. Men with expensive watches speaking to people whose names they never bothered to learn. He had learned years ago that dignity did not require an audience. So he let the insult pass. Victoria picked up the pen again. Caleb spoke. The breach did not start where they told you it started. The pen stopped. Richard's smile faded by half an inch. Excuse me. Caleb looked toward Victoria. Your information security team says the files were taken remotely. They were, Richard said quickly. That has already been established. Caleb shook his head once. No. The room quieted. And how exactly would a facilities supervisor know that? Richard asked. Caleb walked toward the table and placed a folded maintenance report beside Victoria's resignation papers. Because at 2:17 yesterday morning, 3 secure doors opened in a sequence they were never supposed to open in. Victoria looked down at the report. Richard stared at Caleb. You fix air conditioners. Caleb met his eyes. And doors. Nobody laughed this time. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere outside the boardroom, an elevator bell rang and disappeared into silence. Victoria slowly set the pen down. What 3 doors? Caleb pointed toward the report. Server access. Prototype storage. Executive security. Richard's jaw tightened. Caleb continued, still calm. Someone did not break into your network from the outside. Victoria looked up at him. Then what happened? Caleb glanced once toward Richard. Someone walked in. For several seconds, nobody in the boardroom spoke. Victoria looked from Caleb to the maintenance report, then back to Richard. You said the intrusion came through an external server. Richard folded his hands calmly. Because that is what our cybersecurity team found. Caleb did not argue. He simply stood beside the table, quiet enough to make the room uncomfortable. That silence was familiar to him. Most people filled silence because they feared what might appear inside it. Caleb had learned to let it work. Richard leaned forward. Mr. Morgan, this company employs specialists with advanced degrees in network security. You manage building systems. Let them do their jobs. Caleb gave a small nod. I usually do. One board member exhaled impatiently. Then why are you here? Caleb looked at the report again. Because the doors are my job. The answer was simple. That made it harder to dismiss. Earlier that morning, before sunrise, Caleb had been in the basement mechanical room replacing a worn sensor on an air handling unit. At 5:30, the The building had been nearly silent, with only the soft hum of ventilation and the occasional click of automatic locks resetting for the day. That was when he noticed the access log printed from the overnight facilities report. 3 secure doors, 3 unusual openings, 217, 219, 222. Different floors, same direction. Caleb had stared at those times longer than anyone else would have. Not because he expected sabotage, because patterns bothered him. At 6:15, he had folded the report into his lunch bag and driven 12 miles home to wake Emily for school. Pancakes or cereal? He had asked. Emily had looked at the clock. You already worked? A little. Dad, normal people sleep. I have heard rumors. She had laughed, and for 10 minutes Caleb had been nothing more than a father packing apple slices into a lunchbox and reminding his daughter about her math quiz. That was the life he protected now. No uniforms with names sewn above the pocket. No people asking what he had done before Hale Dynamics. No stories about the Navy. Emily knew he had served. She did not know much more. Caleb preferred it that way. At work, people rarely asked questions. To most executives, he was the man who appeared when a conference room was too cold or a badge reader stopped working. Once, a vice president had handed him an empty coffee cup while he was repairing a ceiling vent and said, "Trash is over there." Caleb had taken the cup, thrown it away, and returned to the vent. No correction, no humiliation displayed, just grace. He did not need strangers to know who he had once been. Back in the boardroom, Victoria unfolded the report completely. Why did nobody flag this? Caleb answered. Facilities software marked each entry as authorized. Richard seized on the word. There. Authorized. End of mystery. Caleb looked at him. Authorized does not mean normal. Richard's jaw tightened. Victoria noticed. Explain. Caleb pointed to the first timestamp. Server access opened at 2:17. Prototype storage opened 2 minutes later. Executive security opened 3 minutes after that. So, Richard asked. They are on separate floors, Caleb said. Almost 400 feet apart if you use the main corridor. A board member frowned. Can someone move that fast? Caleb paused. Not by the route the cameras would show. Victoria slowly pushed her resignation document away. Richard saw it happen. Victoria, do not let a maintenance report derail a board decision. Caleb said nothing. He did not need to. Victoria closed the pen and set it on the table. Then she looked at Caleb with a question that had nothing to do with facilities anymore. Mr. Morgan, what route would someone have used? Caleb raised his eyes toward the secured service hallway beyond the glass wall. The one most people in this room do not know exists. Victoria rose from her chair, and the room shifted with her. Not because she raised her voice. Because she had stopped surrendering. Show me. Richard immediately stood. Victoria, this is unnecessary. She looked at him. So was asking me to resign before the internal review was complete. His expression tightened. Caleb picked up the maintenance report and walked toward the glass doors. The board followed reluctantly, expensive shoes clicking across polished stone while he led them into a service corridor none of them had reason to notice before. The air was cooler there. The carpet gave way to gray tile. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the walls carried small access panels, utility labels, and fire doors without decoration. Caleb stopped beside a narrow secured door near the end of the hallway. This connects the executive floor to the restricted technical wing. One director frowned. I have worked here 11 years. I have never seen this. Caleb looked at the badge reader. Most people use the elevators. Richard crossed his arms. And what exactly does this prove? Caleb answered. Nothing yet. That irritated him more than an accusation would have. Victoria watched Caleb place his badge near the reader without scanning it. Who can access this route? She asked. Facilities. Security. A small number of executives with emergency clearance. Richard said, which means dozens of people. Caleb looked at him. 7. The hallway went quiet. Victoria turned. 7. As of last month. Richard gave a dismissive laugh. You memorize access lists now? Caleb's face remained calm. Only when they change. He opened the maintenance report and pointed to a line near the bottom. One credential had been added to the route 12 days earlier. Executive override. Richard Voss. Victoria read the name twice. Richard stepped closer. That does not mean I used it. I did not say you did. Caleb folded the page again. Richard stopped. The restraint in Caleb's voice was beginning to unsettle him. No accusation. No performance. Just facts appearing one at a time. Victoria looked at the door. Where does this lead? Down one level, behind prototype storage. From there, a service stair reaches executive security without entering a public hallway. One of the directors stared at Caleb. That matches the timestamps. Caleb nodded once. It can. Richard repeated. You keep speaking like you know more than you are saying. Caleb looked through the small, wired glass window in the door. Because there is something I have not checked yet. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What? The mechanical sensor. Richard exhaled sharply. Now we are investigating air vents. Caleb ignored the sarcasm. This door has two systems. The badge reader records permission. The hinge sensor records movement. Victoria understood first. So a copied credential could lie about who entered. Yes. But the door itself cannot lie about when it opened. Caleb looked at her. Exactly. They returned to the facility's control room 5 minutes later. The space smelled faintly of dust and warm electronics. Monitors displayed temperature zones, alarms, and building status. Caleb entered the date from the previous night and opened the mechanical history. 2:17 in the morning. Server access opened. 2:19. Prototype route opened. 2:22. Executive security opened. Then Caleb scrolled farther. His hand stopped. Victoria leaned closer. What is it? He enlarged the record. The prototype route had opened twice, not once. The second opening happened at 2:26. Richard's face changed. Caleb looked at the screen, then at him. Someone went back. The second opening changed the room. Victoria stared at the screen while the directors exchanged uneasy looks behind her. Richard was the first to speak. That could be anything. A delayed sensor. A maintenance error. Caleb kept his eyes on the record. It could. Richard seemed almost relieved. Then this is over. Caleb scrolled down. Not yet. Victoria watched him open another system log. What are you looking for? The loading dock. Richard laughed once. Now the loading dock is part of your conspiracy? Caleb did not answer the insult. He entered the same date and searched the overnight access history. 2:31 in the morning. Bay 3 opened for 47 seconds. No delivery scheduled. No vehicle registered. The room became quiet again. Victoria folded her arms. 5 minutes after someone returned through the prototype route. Caleb nodded. Yes. Richard stepped closer to the monitor. You are connecting unrelated events because you want them to mean something. Caleb looked at him. I do not want them to mean anything. His voice remained low. I would prefer this was a broken sensor. That answer unsettled Victoria. Caleb was not trying to win. He was trying to be right. There was a difference, and suddenly she could see it. What was stored in prototype storage last night? Caleb asked. Victoria answered immediately. The guidance architecture for Project Sentinel. One board member inhaled sharply. Project Sentinel was the reason the company existed at the edge of government scrutiny. The technology had never been approved for external transfer. Richard shook his head. This is exactly why we need experienced leadership instead of panic. Victoria turned toward him. Experienced leadership told me the breach came from overseas. Because that is what the preliminary report said. Caleb closed the loading dock record and opened a floor map. Who prepared that report? Richard did not answer immediately. Cybersecurity. Who authorized it? Victoria asked. Richard's eyes moved toward her. My office coordinated the review. The words landed softly. Caleb pointed to a narrow corridor behind the loading bay. There is one more thing. Richard's patience snapped. Of course there is. Caleb remained still. Camera 7 covers this hallway. Then pull the footage, Victoria said. Caleb did. The recording loaded. 2:28. Empty corridor. 2:29. Empty. 2:30. The image jumped forward 4 minutes. 2:34. Empty again. One director leaned closer. Where did the 4 minutes go? Caleb answered. Someone removed them. Richard shook his head. Or the camera malfunctioned. Caleb clicked another tab. Camera 8 did not. He brought up the neighboring feed. The timestamp ran continuously. No interruption. Victoria looked from one screen to the other. So only the camera facing the route to Bay 3 lost footage. Yes. Richard pointed at Caleb. And who has access to these systems? Facilities. The accusation came quickly. Too quickly. Every face turned toward Caleb. He did not flinch. Facilities has diagnostic access. We cannot delete archived security video. Victoria looked at Richard. Who can? Caleb answered before he could. Executive security, cybersecurity administrators, and 2 executive overrides. Richard's face went still. Whose? Victoria asked. Caleb opened the permissions list. Her own name appeared first. The second name sat directly beneath it. Richard Voss. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Richard smiled, but the confidence was gone. This proves nothing. Caleb nodded. You are right. Richard blinked. Caleb turned toward Victoria. It only proves someone wanted 4 minutes to disappear. Victoria studied the screen, then the man beside her. What happens in those 4 minutes? Caleb looked toward the loading dock map. That is what somebody is afraid we will find out. Victoria did not move from the monitor. Then we find out. Richard stepped between her and the door. No. We stop this before someone destroys evidence by wandering around areas they are not authorized to investigate. Caleb looked at him. Nobody said anything about investigating. Richard's eyes narrowed. You are enjoying this, are you? Caleb's expression did not change. No. The answer came so quickly that even Victoria looked at him differently. There was no pride in his face. No satisfaction in watching Richard lose control. Only focus. Only quiet. That was when a security supervisor entered the facilities room with 2 officers behind him. Mr. Morgan. Caleb turned. The supervisor held up a printed access report. We need to speak with you. Victoria frowned. About what? The supervisor placed the paper on the desk. Caleb's employee badge number appeared beside the restricted prototype entrance at 2:19 in the morning. Then again near Bay 3 at 2:31. Richard exhaled slowly, almost with relief. Well, Victoria looked at Caleb. Were you here last night? Yes. At 2:19? No. One director shook his head. Your badge says otherwise. Caleb looked at the page for several seconds. My badge was in my locker. Richard gave a thin smile. Convenient. The security supervisor said, Mr. Morgan, until we verify this, we have to restrict your access. Caleb nodded. Understood. Victoria stepped forward. You cannot seriously believe he orchestrated this after being the person who brought us the logs. Richard answered before security could. That is exactly what someone would do if they wanted to control the story. Caleb said nothing. The accusation landed in the room and stayed there. Security asked for his badge. Caleb unclipped it from his shirt and handed it over without protest. The small piece of plastic that had opened doors for him every day suddenly looked heavier than it should have. Dad. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Emily stood beside the receptionist from the lobby, backpack still over one shoulder, her face confused. Caleb's entire posture changed. Not weaker, softer. Emily, what are you doing up here? You were supposed to meet me downstairs. She looked at the security officers, then at the badge in the supervisor's hand. Are you in trouble? Caleb walked toward her slowly. No. Richard looked away. Emily lowered her voice. They think you did something. Caleb crouched until they were eye level. Sometimes people see one piece of a story and think they understand all of it. Do they? No. Then tell them. Caleb gave the smallest smile. I will. Emily looked toward the adults behind him. You always say the truth matters. It does. Even when nobody believes you. Caleb paused. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere in the hall, a door lock clicked shut. He looked at his daughter and spoke quietly. Especially then. The security supervisor cleared his throat. Mr. Morgan, we need you to come with us. Caleb stood. Emily reached for his hand. I am coming too. No, you stay with Miss Carter downstairs. Dad. Emily. She knew that tone. She let go, but her eyes stayed on him. As Caleb walked past Richard, the chief operating officer leaned closer. You should have stayed with the air conditioners. Caleb stopped. For 1 second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then he looked at Richard and said, You should have left the doors alone. Richard's face tightened. Security led Caleb toward the elevator. Victoria watched the doors close between them. Then she turned back to the access report. Something about it bothered her. She picked it up, read the timestamps again, and suddenly froze. Caleb's badge had been used at 2:19. But she remembered exactly where Caleb had been at 2:17 because the facilities system had logged him manually restarting the basement air unit on another floor. 2 locations, 2 minutes apart, nearly half a mile of building between them. Victoria looked at Richard. He was still smiling. She set the report down. There is a problem. Richard's smile faded. What problem? Victoria pointed to the timestamps. Caleb Morgan could not have been in both places. Victoria held the access report in both hands and read the timestamps again. 2:17 in the morning, Caleb had manually restarted the basement air unit. 2:19, his badge supposedly opened the prototype route several floors away. Even using the fastest elevator, the timing made no sense. Richard recovered first. Systems record delays all the time. Victoria looked at him. Not this system. You are not an engineer. No, but Caleb is the one who showed us how precise these logs are. Richard's expression hardened. Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened at the end of the corridor. Two federal security officials stepped out with the building's supervisor walking beside them. The older of the two officials scanned the room, then looked through the glass toward the security office where Caleb was waiting. He stopped. Completely. Is that Caleb Morgan? The supervisor blinked. Yes. Facilities. The federal officer did not move for another second. Then he walked toward the security office with a look that made everyone else fall quiet. Caleb stood when the door opened. Mr. Morgan, the supervisor began, but the federal officer spoke over him. Chief Morgan. Caleb's face changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Recognition. That was a long time ago. The officer stared at him. Not to everyone. Victoria reached the doorway just in time to hear it. You know him? The federal officer turned. I know his name. Richard appeared behind her. From where? The man glanced at Caleb, giving him a brief moment to object. Caleb said nothing. Naval Special Warfare, the officer said. Former Navy SEAL. Silence fell so completely that even the soft hum of the ventilation system seemed louder. Emily, standing farther down the hallway with the receptionist, looked at her father with wide eyes. Dad. Caleb rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. I told you I was in the Navy. Emily folded her arms. You left out a lot. The federal officer almost smiled. Richard did not. This changes nothing, he said. Caleb looked at him. You are right. Richard blinked. Caleb continued. My past does not prove where I was last night. Victoria studied him. Even now, with the room finally looking at him differently, he refused to use respect as evidence. The federal officer nodded once. Good. Then we use facts. He introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Reed, assigned to protective security for the government program connected to Project Sentinel. Victoria handed him the access report. His badge was used 2 minutes after he manually logged work nearly half a mile away. Reed read the page. Badge cloning. Caleb answered carefully. Possible. Or duplicated credential data. Richard scoffed. Now suddenly the maintenance man is an identity security expert. Reed looked at him. Chief Morgan spent years in environments where physical access and compromised credentials could decide whether people came home. I would listen before dismissing him. Richard went quiet. Caleb stepped toward the monitor in the security office. There is a simpler way. He pulled up the basement mechanical record from 217 and pointed to the manual service confirmation. This entry requires local input from the panel itself. Reed nodded, meaning he had to be physically there. Yes. Caleb opened the elevator log. No elevator left the basement between 217 and 221. Then he opened the service stair alarm record. No door opened there either. Victoria understood before anyone said it. So Caleb did not use that badge. Reed looked at Richard. Someone used his identity. Richard's face tightened. Caleb opened one more line of data, a credential maintenance entry from 12 days earlier. His badge profile had been copied during a system permissions update. The authorization code attached to the copy belonged to executive operations. Victoria slowly turned toward Richard. Who approved the update? Caleb did not answer immediately. He let the screen speak first. The authorization field displayed one name. Richard Voss. Emily looked at her father. The directors stared at Richard. Agent Reed folded the report closed. And for the first time since the board meeting began, Richard had nothing to say. Richard stared at the authorization field as if the name might change if he waited long enough. It did not. Victoria stepped closer to the monitor. You approved the credential copy. Richard finally looked at her. Executive Operations approves dozens of system updates every week. Then explain this one. I do not have to explain routine administration because a facilities employee found a line of code he does not understand. Special Agent Thomas Reed closed the distance between them by one step. He understands it. Richard turned sharply. And because he used to be a Navy SEAL, suddenly he is an expert on corporate systems? Caleb answered before Reed could. No. His voice was quiet. Because I maintain this building. The simplicity of it landed harder than anger would have. Caleb opened the credential history again. The copied profile was created at 6:42 in the evening 12 days ago. My original badge never left my possession. Richard crossed his arms. That still proves nothing. Caleb nodded. Not by itself. He brought up another record. The copied credential had been assigned a temporary device identification number. Victoria leaned toward the screen. Can you trace it? Only if it touched another reader after last night. Reed looked at him. Did it? Caleb searched. One entry appeared. Executive parking garage. 7:18 that morning. Richard's face went still. Victoria noticed. Which vehicle entered? Caleb opened the garage camera index. Richard stepped forward. This is becoming absurd. Reed held up one hand. Let him finish. The camera archive showed a black company sedan entering through Gate 2. The license plate belonged to Executive Fleet Services. Victoria read the assignment field. Vehicle 27. She looked at Richard. That is yours. Richard exhaled. Half the executive team can request those cars. But they do not take them home, Victoria said. You do. No one spoke. Caleb clicked into the vehicle access record. At 7:16, the sedan had left Richard's residential garage using its registered transponder. 2 minutes later, the copied credential had been scanned inside the company parking structure. Reed folded his arms. That is a very short list of coincidences. Richard shook his head. Someone is framing me. Caleb looked at him. That is possible. Victoria turned toward Caleb, surprised by the fairness in his voice. Richard almost smiled. Then Caleb continued. Which is why we should not stop with your badge record either. The smile vanished. Caleb opened the system audit trail. Every security change created a secondary verification file stored offline for compliance. It was not connected to the same administrative network. Richard stared at the screen. Victoria understood immediately. The audit backup. Caleb nodded. If the primary logs were altered, the offline copy should still show the original sequence. Richard's voice sharpened. Only compliance has access to that. Victoria looked at him. Exactly. She reached into her briefcase and removed a small encrypted drive. And compliance gave me a copy this morning. For the first time, Caleb looked genuinely surprised. Victoria placed the drive beside the keyboard. I did not suspend Project Sentinel because I panicked. I suspended it because I knew someone inside the company was manipulating the investigation. Richard's face drained of confidence. You knew? I suspected. Then why the resignation? Victoria looked toward the boardroom at the end of the hall. Because I wanted to see who rushed to take control before the evidence was reviewed. Silence settled over the group. Caleb glanced at Victoria with something new in his expression. Respect. She had not been surrendering. She had been waiting. Reed connected the encrypted drive to a secure terminal. The untouched audit log appeared moments later. 219. Copied credential. 231. Bay 3. 229 to 233. Camera deletion request. One executive authorization code appeared beside all three actions. Richard Voss. Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked at Caleb's uniform. Nobody questioned whether he belonged in the room. Richard looked from Victoria to Reed, then finally to Caleb. You planned this together. Victoria shook her head. No. She looked at Caleb. That is the part you never understood. Caleb met Richard's eyes. We just followed the truth. Richard said nothing for several seconds. The room had turned against him without anyone raising a voice. That was the part he seemed unable to understand. He had spent years believing power came from controlling the room, controlling the information, controlling who spoke first. Now the truth sat on a secure terminal in plain sight, and control no longer belonged to him. Special Agent Thomas Reed looked at the audit log, then at Richard. Mr. Voss, you will need to remain available while we secure the records and notify the appropriate federal investigators. Richard gave a dry laugh. You are treating an internal compliance dispute like a national security case. Reed's expression did not change. Project Sentinel involves restricted defense technology. That stopped being an internal dispute the moment protected data was transferred. Victoria stood beside Caleb, arms folded, her face calm now. Where was it going? Richard looked at her, but did not answer. Reed turned back to the screen. That is what the next part of the investigation will determine. Caleb remained quiet. Emily had been escorted back downstairs with the receptionist, and that seemed to matter more to him than anything happening in the room. Victoria noticed him glance toward the elevator twice. "She is safe," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "I know. You still want to go check?" "Yes." Victoria almost smiled. "Go." Caleb looked toward Reed. "You need anything else from me?" Reed studied him for a moment. "You have already given us more than enough to preserve the scene and verify the timeline." Richard scoffed. "Listen to this. The maintenance man gets thanked while I get treated like a criminal." Caleb turned toward him. There was no triumph in his face. "You are still worried about titles." Richard stared at him. Caleb continued. "That is why you missed what mattered." Victoria looked at Caleb. What did he miss? Caleb pointed toward the boardroom through the glass. Everyone in there knew the network. Richard knew the executives, but nobody asked who knew the building. Reed gave a slow nod. Physical access, doors, service routes, loading bays, systems people stop seeing because they work every day. Victoria looked down at the discarded resignation papers still visible on the conference table. Less than an hour earlier, she had been ready to sign away control of the company because every powerful person around her had insisted the facts were already settled. The man who changed that had been the one person they considered too unimportant to listen to. She turned toward Richard. "You counted on that, did not you?" He said nothing. "You counted on nobody respecting facilities enough to question the logs." Richard's jaw tightened. This company would be nothing without people making actual decisions. Caleb answered quietly. "A company is everyone who keeps it standing." That silenced the room again. Reed began directing security to preserve the terminals and restrict executive access. Board members drifted back toward the conference room, no longer looking at Caleb the way they had before. One director stopped beside him. "Mr. Morgan." Caleb looked up. "Yes, sir." The man hesitated. "I owe you an apology." Caleb shook his head. "You owe the next person respect before you know their resume." The director lowered his eyes. Victoria heard every word. 10 minutes later, the board reconvened. Richard's voting authority had been suspended pending investigation. Victoria's resignation document remained unsigned. When she entered, no one asked her to step down. One member cleared his throat. "Victoria, we believe the suspension of Project Sentinel should remain in place until federal review is complete." She nodded. "That is what I said this morning." No one argued. Caleb stood near the back wall, waiting only because Reed had asked him to remain available. Victoria looked around the table. "Before we continue, there is someone this board dismissed before hearing a single fact." Every face turned toward Caleb. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Victoria continued. "Today he protected this company without asking for credit, authority, or permission to matter." Caleb lowered his gaze. Richard, standing under security supervision near the doorway, watched the room with a bitterness that no longer had power. Victoria looked directly at Caleb. "Mr. Morgan, would you come to the table?" Caleb paused. Then he walked forward. Not like a former Navy SEAL. Not like a hero. Just like the same single father in worn work boots who had entered the room and told her not to sign. This time, nobody laughed. Caleb took the empty chair at the far end of the table, but he did not sit until Victoria did. The gesture was small, almost old-fashioned, and somehow it told her more about him than the military record ever could. Around them, the boardroom had changed. The same polished table, the same cold lights, the same people, but the laughter was gone. In its place was something quieter. Respect. Special Agent Thomas Reed remained near the door while federal investigators secured the relevant systems. Richard Voss had been removed from executive authority pending the investigation, and Project Sentinel remained suspended until every line of access data could be independently reviewed. Victoria looked at the unsigned resignation papers in front of her, then pushed them aside. "This meeting is adjourned." No one objected. Caleb stood immediately. "I should get Emily." Victoria followed him into the hallway. "Mr. Morgan." He stopped. "Yes." "You saved my position today." Caleb shook his head. "No. The records did." "You found the records." "Because it is my job to notice when something in the building is wrong." Victoria studied him. "And the Navy?" Caleb looked toward the elevator. "That was another job. Most people would have mentioned it. Most people were not trying to forget it. The elevator doors opened. Emily stepped out before either of them could continue, still wearing her backpack. Dad. Caleb's face softened at once. Hey, are you still in trouble? No. She looked at Victoria. Is he? Victoria smiled. Your father is the reason a lot of people are asking better questions today. Emily nodded seriously. He does that. Caleb sighed. Do not encourage her. For the first time that day, Victoria laughed. It was not the controlled laugh of a chief executive in front of a board. It was human, tired, relieved. 3 months later, Hale Dynamics looked different in ways the public would never see. The federal investigation had confirmed that Richard had manipulated access credentials and attempted to conceal the transfer of restricted project data. He was formally charged, and the board completed an independent review of its security failures. Project Sentinel remained paused until new safeguards were approved. Victoria stayed as chief executive officer, but she changed more than procedures. Facility staff were included in security planning. Custodial teams were invited to report unusual access without going through executive filters. People who had once been invisible in the building suddenly had names. Caleb received an offer to become director of physical security. The salary was larger than anything he had earned since leaving the Navy. He turned it down. Victoria found him the next morning replacing a damaged door closer near the east stairwell. You rejected it. I did. Why? Caleb tightened one screw. Too many nights. Too much travel. We can change that. He looked at her. Emily is 10 once. Victoria went quiet. Then what would you accept? Caleb thought for a moment. Security advisor. 3 days a week. I keep facilities the other 2. You want to keep fixing doors? Somebody should. She smiled. Done. He returned to the hinge. Victoria stayed beside him. Can I ask you something? You usually do. Why did you walk into that boardroom that day? Caleb stopped working. For a moment, the hallway filled only with the soft click of the door settling into place. Because everyone else was leaving you alone. Victoria looked down. You barely knew me. Did not matter. Why? Caleb picked up his tools. Because dignity should not depend on whether somebody knows your name. She carried that sentence with her long after he walked away. Weeks later, Emily visited the office after school and found Victoria sitting with Caleb in the cafeteria instead of the executive dining room. You two are friends now? Emily asked. Caleb looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Caleb. We are working on it, she said. Emily smiled. Good. Dad needs more people. Caleb gave her a look. Homework. She laughed and opened her backpack. Outside the windows, evening lights stretched across the Hale Dynamics campus. No applause. No ceremony. No medals. Just a father, a daughter, and a woman who had learned that leadership was not about being the most powerful person in the room. It was about knowing who deserved to be heard. Caleb had spent years trying to become ordinary again. In the end, what changed everyone was not that he had once been a Navy SEAL. It was that after everything he had seen, everything he had lost, and every insult he had quietly endured, he had still chosen grace over pride, truth over recognition, and respect over revenge. And that was the kind of strength no title could ever give.